family, and welcome to this episode of Legacy Chat. My name is Rick, and I'm an alcoholic. I was given the gift of sobriety on November 17th, 1987, and it's my privilege to be your host for this episode. Legacy Chat is a podcast made by and for members of AA to share their experience, strength, and hope on all three of our legacies in Alcoholics Anonymous. And it's a service of TakeThe12.org. That's TakeThe12.org, a three-legacy study website. All episodes of this podcast will be available to listen to or download completely free on TakeThe12.org. The primary purpose of our time together is to create a discussion space of our three legacies so our listeners might be able to have a richer and more personal experience of AA's 12 steps, 12 traditions, and 12 concepts for world service. Legacy Chat is not affiliated with Alcoholics Anonymous, and neither myself nor any of my guests in this podcast speak for AA as a whole. We're only here today to share our own unique experience on one of AA's three legacies. On today's episode, we're going to be talking about step 9, and I am really excited to have my special guest with us today, Matt C. Matt, what I want you to do first is I want you to introduce yourself. Tell us where you're from, your home group, your sobriety date, and a little bit about how you got to AA.
Sure. Thank you, Rick. My name is Matt C. I'm an alcoholic. My sobriety date is August 24th, 2006. My home group is the Friday Night Lights group in Austin, Texas. I currently live in the Austin metro area. I'm originally from Louisiana. I actually got sober in Louisiana in 2006, and I was actually 19 years old. It wasn't my first introduction to Alcoholics Anonymous. It was actually, I don't know, probably the second or third time that I'd tried to attempt to get sober in Alcoholics Anonymous and other various fellowships. And essentially, what got me to the place where I got sober is I'd came in and out of AA for several years, and essentially my life continued to get worse, and I knew that I had a problem with alcohol. And eventually what happened was I really realized that I never gave AA a fair shot, and I never really truly surrendered. I never really worked the steps, never really did anything. And I had sponsors by name at some points in those peaks of sobriety that I had, which wouldn't really last for very long. The longest that I ever had was 4 months whenever I was 15 years old. And so eventually I surrendered all. And I didn't know if I was going to get sober in AA or if somewhere else, but I knew that I had to stop trying to do it on my own. And I was in a real place of surrender. I had gotten into a halfway house. I was in some legal trouble. And I complied with the halfway house and did what they suggested me to do. And thankfully, that halfway house was a big book halfway house that was really, firm in the steps, and told me that they wanted me to sponsor other people by the time I was leaving and things like that. And so that really got me to a place where I got sober, and that's kind of what happened, And I spent, from the age 12 to 19, 7 years of my life, totaled about 3 cars. Was facing felony charges, had overdosed, been to the hospital several times, went to the mental institution. I'd been through the ringer, at 19, and I went into that halfway house with people who were mostly older than me. Most of them were 40, 50, and 60 years old, and hit a place where essentially they had found themselves at that age. And it didn't take me 20, 30 years of drinking. It affects everybody differently, and some people can drink successfully for a certain period of time. That's just not my experience. From the second that I started drinking, I was out of control, never really wanted to be in control either. So that's kind of what happened.
I thank you. And having had the opportunity to hear your story, I know that you came and spoke at my home group several months ago. I don't remember how long ago it was, but so I've gotten to hear the whole story, and that is a great synopsis of it. It is powerful beyond imagination, and I know that you are committed and dedicated to carrying the message that we have in Alcoholics Anonymous. So thank you so much for being here tonight. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no worries.
All right,
I appreciate
so let's jump right into it. From the forward of the 12 and 12, it says this: AA's 12 steps are a group of principles, spiritual in their nature, which, if practiced as a way of life, can expel the obsession to drink and enable the sufferer to become happily and usefully whole. One of the reasons that I love reading that from the forward of the 12 and 12 anytime I'm connected to any kind of presentation on the steps is because I believe it's one of the best examples or definitions of exactly what our 12 steps are, right? A group of principles, spiritual in nature, pretty simple, pretty straightforward. I love the next little moniker, which, if practiced as a way of life, not just when it's convenient, not when I feel like it, but as a way of life, right? It can do several things. It can expel the obsession to drink, which certainly was the truth in my case. But the next part of it, I love the most. It's two parts. It's an external part and an internal part. It can enable the sufferer, me, to become happily whole. That's the internal side. And usefully whole. That's the external side. Now, I can tell you the very first time I ever read that in the forward, I didn't have that understanding. But I'm grateful for strong sponsorship and a lot of people like yourself who have been a massive inspiration to help me want to go deeper in understanding the steps. So I just always like to start off with that. And I also, when we're doing a step, I want to read the actual steps. So since we're doing step 9, I'm going to throw it out there. The step is this: made direct amends to such people wherever possible, except when to do so would injure them or others. And because we know that every one of our steps, traditions, and concepts has a spiritual principle that's attached to it, I like to use, not everyone does, but I like to use the spiritual principle of discipline on this one. And how am I practicing discipline in my life today, not just around the amends process, but in other ways of my life as well. And lastly, I've always believed that with each step, there's at least one thing that I need to walk away remembering about that step. And in step 9, I believe it's very simply everything that got us up to step 8. In 9, the action continues. So I want to throw it out to you now. Why did you say yes to speaking on this step?
It's a great question. Thank you for the question, Rick. And so, yeah, this is the amends process has been my favorite part of the whole working the steps part. And so going through that, right, I worked a good chunk of step 1 while I was out there drinking, figuring out that alcohol didn't agree with me, right? And then I come in and then I get the actual way that the big book lays out what alcoholism in the first few chapters, right? And then we start going into it, and a lot of hype was built up around the inventory process and doing a 5th step. And I'd got to that point and I had a sigh of relief and then kind of really felt bad. And the other thing was that I had essentially tried another fellowship and it just didn't work. And it's not a knock on any other fellowship, but it was very, very much a slower process. And once I got clear that I was suffering from alcoholism, no matter what my other, things that I had wrong with me were, my sponsor laid out alcoholism in a very simple way. I accepted that maybe the big book would be a better solution to go through that process. And it was very quick. It wasn't that I was looking for a quick fix, but I was ready to make my amends. And in the other fellowship, the sponsor that I had in that other fellowship really didn't, they wanted to kind of pace it a little bit slow. And that works for some people. I know plenty of people with that process is, but I knew in my heart of hearts that if I needed to make restitution. And so the amends process has been the most powerful process in this whole journey for me in particular. And the way that I can break it out is kind of what I was going through with the steps. I was explaining that, working step 1 and all that, I had little bits of chunks of hope, right? Through each little process, little small wins, right? Things would go well at work or things would go bad and I'd handle it right. Or I would realize that I'm acting in a different way and I'm becoming a person that's grounded in different roots, right? But once I got, halfway through the amends process, I felt a lighten of the load and I really felt all of that hope that I'd had and the belief that this may work for me. Just may. I wasn't 100% sold that it would work for me. Once I went through the amends process, that obsession to drink left me. And I also felt that I was really, becoming usefully whole. And that excerpt that you said is very important. I came here because I wanted to quit drinking. And whenever I quit drinking, I realized that I had a lot more bigger problems than just the physical me drinking. Right.
Right.
And my life got worse whenever I got sober. It didn't just necessarily by the touch of a button get better. And the amends is really where I started to cut deep into some things that really just kind of let loose of a lot of those things that were holding me down.
Well, so you said that you knew deep in your heart that restitution was part of this deal, or that you wanted to participate in restitution. How does one know that deep in their heart at that point?
It's a great question. I mean, for me, I had some lurking notion that if I got through the amends process or majority of through the amends process, that um, that my life would change and that I would be over some hump. And I can't really explain it, but I kind of knew once I went through and I did my fifth step, especially after I did my fifth step the second time with the new sponsor in AA,
Hmm.
that I was left with all these character defects and all this junk, right?
Right.
And the inventory process really just puts a magnifying glass on it. It doesn't, for me at least, and this is all just my experience.
Sure.
Um, Other people might have a different experience, but I get a magnifying glass once I do that, and I become aware of my character defects after I do an inventory and I really look at them in 6 and 7. But what am I left to do with all the things that I've done in the past, right? And what do I currently do? And I kind of just had a lurking notion that this was going to be a big part of it, and that I don't know if it was a God thing or what it was, but deep down in my heart, I knew it. It was something that I was not very sure if I was going to quit drinking at 19 coming into AA this time. I wasn't very sure, but I was very sure that if I went through the amends process, something was going to happen. And we don't
Right.
necessarily do it for relief, but there was a huge relief. It's a byproduct of it. But
Well, yeah, yeah, and you're absolutely right. I mean, and um we don't do it for the relief, right? I mean, I remember th- thinking that I was doing it for the relief or doing it for the outcome, right? I want to get back in the good graces of those that I've wronged, those that I've hurt. And if I come clean, as it were, and do my part, that all of a sudden they're going to like me again. And our literature is very clear about the fact that that's not the goal. That's not the end result of me wanting to have them like me again, or to have a friendship again or a relationship again. It very specifically says in step 9 in our book that the whole purpose, the primary purpose of step 9 is to become of maximum service to God and to his kids. And the first time I read that, I was like, yeah, right, whatever. I mean, sure, that's kind of the overarching thing of the recovery process, but why specifically this? But I think that you hit it, is that when I have that lurking notion that something inside of me just is no longer the way I used to be, the way I used to live my life no longer works for me anymore. I've got to start doing things differently. Then possibly cleaning up my side of the street as part of that. It reminded me when you were talking a minute ago of when Bill had his white light experience in Towns Hospital. And I'm going to paraphrase this, but I envisioned like Dr. Silkworth sticking his head in the door and seeing this changed man. And the very first thought that came to Bill was sitting in that bed was, other people need this too. Right. And that lurking notion that was inside of him of needing to go out and give this away. That's what made me think of that when you were talking about that you can't explain it, but it's just there. Right.
exactly. Yeah.
Um,
And I mean,
no, go ahead.
getting on the other side of it, I mean, it's really one of those things that things started to fall into place.
Right.
One of my first amends to somebody outside of my family was a guy that I used to run with, and I had stolen money from him, and I made the amends. And then whenever I made the amends, essentially, he had hit me up, and most of my amends, I'll say this, most of my amends outside of my family, those people didn't just become my friends again. And
Right.
that's fine. But this guy just decided to hit me up 2 weeks after I'd made the amends, and we're gonna go work out at the gym that I was working at. And he throws a bag of illegal substances out of my car and says, "I want what you have, and something's changed about you, and I'm willing." Basically like something that would be written in the big book. I really can't make it up. And I call my sponsor and I get it, and that's one of my first sponsees that I took all the way through the steps. So, in making restitution and making amends to somebody, I in effect, became a person that was able to be helpful to them. And
Right.
so it's one, and that's where things started to fall into place for me.
I love that. I absolutely love that. I'm gonna take a little bit of a detour and unearth a possible can of worms. I think that you're probably someone that I can do this with and feel safe to do this with. My grand sponsor, Johnny H, has just celebrated 60 years of sobriety, and while I get that he's just a drunk, I do respect the time, the service, what he's done in the Fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. I was sitting in a workshop with him once, and he said something that really kind of shifted some big things for me. And he reminded us that Bill Wilson said, our chief responsibility to the newcomer is to provide a clear and adequate presentation of the program. And I believe that. And he also said that it is our and Johnny said it's our chief or our responsibility to help the newcomer understand that there's a difference between the program of Alcoholics Anonymous and the fellowship of Alcoholics Anonymous. And in this idea of steps and taking the steps, I don't know if it was your experience when you first came in, but it certainly was mine 34 years ago, that I heard a lot of get a sponsor, work the steps, get a sponsor, work the steps, get a sponsor, work the steps. And I at some point went back and did a word search in the first 164 pages to find out that nowhere in our literature in the big book does it say that we work the steps. In fact, it says, here are the steps we took, which are suggested as a program of recovery, right? And I believe that words matter, and I believe that the words on the page matter, and thank God they wrote it down. Do you believe that there's a difference between taking the steps and working the steps?
Great question. And whenever I read that, I simmered on it a bit. And for me personally, I personally don't think that there's a difference. And the reason why is because the process is the same.
Right.
If I'm doing it, if I'm taking it or working it, essentially I'm working with a sponsor who's going line by line in the big book, or the 12 and 12. If you want to do 12 and 12, personally, I think the big book's has more directions in it,
Right.
especially first time. And I always felt like the 12 and 12 is more of, okay, you've gone through the big book. Here's some further explanation of, 10, 15 years after we've gone through all this.
Right.
But I'm doing that and I'm working it and I'm taking it. To me, it's a synonymous name for me. And I also strongly believe words matter, but in that one, I had to sit there and really thought, I really couldn't feel too strongly either way. So I just feel like they're almost the same word to me.
Well, and they're both action, right? And they're both a verb, and it's about regardless of the semantics of it, it is about the action, which is what step 9 is all about, right? Um,
Right.
Let me ask you this question. What were your biggest obstacles when actually executing on step 9, putting, you know, the work in? What were your biggest obstacles in executing this step?
Yeah, great question. So I had probably the biggest obstacle is much like you, I got sober in a different time. So we didn't have Facebook, and not everybody was on MySpace. MySpace was bigger
Right.
than Facebook at the time. You had to have an edu email address to get into Facebook.
Exactly.
But anyway, it was a little bit tougher to find people, and we had flip phone, cell phones, and not everybody had a cell phone. And I think even whenever I made the amends, I didn't have a cell phone for very long. I didn't have everybody's number, and so finding people was probably the biggest obstacle. And finding those people and getting them to sit down. And I'll just a little bit of a disclaimer because I feel like it's important to share. There's two parts of my story that are amends are dramatically important. I mean, every day they're important, right? But the two pivotal points that I think of are right whenever I got sober and I made the majority of my amends, and around 7 or 8 years sober, whenever there was a lot of amends that I didn't make. It wasn't a whole bunch, but they were enough to get me sick of me not having the full experience of being a sober member in Alcoholics Anonymous. And whenever I went back through the work with a new sponsor, that was one of the first things he asked me, do you have any unfinished amends? And it's now one of the first things that I ask people that I sponsor that have time, that have gone through the work, because I need to know, are you doing your nightly reviews? Are you doing daily inventories when things happen and they pop up? Are you working with other people? How many people? And amends is one of those big questions that I ask. It's about 4 or 5 whenever I'm taking somebody through the work that has already gone through the steps. And so whenever I made those amends at the very end of it, some of these people would not sit down with me. And that was a big part of it, was these people, for whatever reason, didn't want to sit with me and hear my amends. It could have been for personal reasons that if I would know the reason, I might be like, oh, wow, I would have never thought of that. Right. And I don't really want to speculate. It's just for whatever reasons, at some of these people, I left letters at their doorsteps, saying, hey, please call me. I need to make amends, and kind of pleading my case of why I was trying to make things right. And some people just like, I had to make an amends to make an amends. And so because of one was with a person who doesn't talk to his mother anymore, and I had to make amends to his mother, and I just didn't have his mom's cell phone number or anything like that. This is early 2000s, of where a lot of this damage was done. And so whenever I went back through it, a lot of these amends where I couldn't do it, and I'm not big on indirect amends, but my sponsor at the time said, you have to do something directly, with somebody. And so I gave a lot of money to charity. We came up with dollar amounts. If there was things that made sense for me to do something indirectly, I've worked with people that have maybe done damage to people, and it's like, well, can you volunteer your time to a certain charity or something that's giving that you get nothing in return of to make that right? I'm not huge on indirect amends, but I feel like no matter what it is, just because somebody doesn't sit down with me or whatever, I have to do something. And so with those that are way in whatever column that you want to put in those lists of these people that just absolutely would never sit down with me, those people in those situations, whatever it was where I had done damage, I had to do something, and we figured out ways to do it. You can get creative. And so I had another spiritual experience later down the road, and it really helped me out.
I love that. And I love that you identified that the indirect amends are as important or are important as well. I know that I had a financial amends that I needed to make, that the company that I needed to make the financial amends to had gone out of business years and years and years ago. And so I sat down with my sponsor, and we determined what the dollar amount was. And we came up with a way in which I could actually make that amends that ended up nothing to do with that company. But the part that was important to me, and the part that I'm grateful for, is that I feel like I have closure on that, right? There is some action that I took that I can now go back to my 8-step list where I wrote it down. I can check it off and put the date on there so that I know that I did my part, right? So I'm really glad you brought up about the indirect amends.
Well, and then bringing it back to, what is this step really about, being of maximum service? Well, if I do certain things, in the way that I look at a big part of the process of working the steps, and especially the amends process, is getting right with God's kids and everybody around me. And whenever I do that and I get right with the universe, even though, like, I think this one trivial thing that I can't really make this amends to this company because they're not there anymore, but whenever I put something out into the universe and I try to fix it somehow, by doing what I can to fix the damage and the harm that I've done, even if it's not directly, something happens. I mean, what comes back to me is that I'm able to be more helpful, and I'm able to be present, and I'm able to be there. And there's some things where I think, like, indirectly, like, I look at this with there's some financial fears things, and if I'm frivolous with my money and things like that, I'm not really present and then right there with people, right? If I have all these things going on, even though I think I'm only harming myself, I'm paying my debts, but I still have all this mountain. But like, things like that, and I have to really think about that. How is it making me less in the moment and less present and more distracted because I have all these other things? And it's crazy how much those things weigh on you. And whenever you do it, it's like, oh, I see the light, life through a different set of glasses.
Right. And as it says in the appendix in Spiritual Experience, that the personality change that we're all called to have, right, as a result of the spiritual awakening, this personality change, so that I do have a profoundly different reaction to life as life is happening to me. I get to start doing things differently than I did before I got to the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, because prior to coming to AA, I could care less about that stuff, right? I just let it fester and I let it pile up. When today I know that by releasing that stuff, I have the ability to grow exponentially in ways that I never even dreamed possible. And on the idea of releasing, I want to talk about the idea of surrender. What did well, let me back up. I believe that in every single one of our steps, there is something that I am called to let go of, some belief, some idea, some belief system that I may have had, that I have had my whole life, that I need to surrender to be able to allow God to do the work in me so that I can actually take that step or work the step or execute the step. In step 9, I've identified in the step study on takethe12.org that there are 3 things that I need to be willing to surrender. And those 3 things are: 1, my hesitation to take action, right? I I I I just need to put one foot in front of the other and just walk through that hesitation. Number 2, my fear that they won't accept my amends. And then 3, the fear of the outcome. And I have personal experience of, I made an amends once to someone. I was living here in Texas, flew out to California to make an amends. And after going through all of this, she looked me straight in the face and she said, Rick, I'm really, really glad that you've gotten your life together because you needed to, but I don't accept your amends and I will never accept your amends. I will never forgive you for what you did. And I remember feeling very devastated at that until I realized that it was just about me doing the work and leaving the results up to God. Have you had any experiences like that?
I've had a few, and I like what you had pointed out about the things. I kind of look at most of my fears centered around amends specifically, and what I need to surrender is usually it's what is the outside world going to look at me like? My ego of personal security,
Right.
financial insecurity, right? Or some other type of instincts. It's usually driven by instincts, and that's what most of my fears are. But yeah, I mean, I had tons of those, and I essentially, you know, once I got to the other side of it, it's kind of like one of those things. Once you do one, and then maybe 3, 4, 6 months go by, and then something happens, you're like, oh wow. You essentially realize, oh wow, whenever I do this, whenever I do good, I get good. It doesn't need to be like, oh, I'm gonna give all this money to charity indirectly to fix this, and then I get $1 million. But I can tell you, until about year 8, and I didn't go back and make all those financial amends, I couldn't hold a job and get promoted and do a lot of the things. Like, I was having a real hindrance, and I didn't know that at the time. But after I made amends and took responsibility, I grew as a person and as an adult. So some of the amends that happened, most of them were good and people accepted it, which is really strange. The ones where it was a little bit tougher, where I made it was kind of unsure. I made one to a friend of the family, and whenever I did it, he's one of us, or he's said that he's one of us in different times of our lives. And I went and made the amends, and he started kind of being patriotic about AA and making fun of me for being in AA, and kind of asking questions. And then he just was, just picking on me a little bit. But it wasn't, I took it personal whenever I left there, like, oh wow, this just didn't work out. And then, like, years later, I
Is
saw him,
that
and I
really
was like,
what you
oh
thought? This didn't work out, or
yeah.
were you like pissed?
I wasn't really like, I there's some amends where I didn't care how they went, right? I didn't care.
Gotcha.
All I cared is that I showed up. Some of them I was like, a part of me, and kind of what you were saying, like, you felt crushed. Part of me, my ego wanted them to like me and to praise me and to do
Right.
that. Even though, like, I didn't, it was very subconscious, right? And I did that. And essentially kind of I walked away from that feeling like, did I do something wrong? Or, and I took it personal. But like you said, like, whether or not they throw me out of the office or they praise me, it really doesn't matter as long as I've done what I need to do. Another one of the hard, I wouldn't say I felt like it went well. Another one of the hardest amends that I made was to my dad. And he's also in this fellowship, and he essentially was like trying to make amends to me, and there was all these things, and he's known to get resentful and go down rabbit holes about things dealing with my mom's side of the family, and I saw it very clearly that that's what's about to happen, even though he was making amends to me. And I said very clearly, and I was like 19 or 20 at this time, I said, Dad, I'm here to clear off the side of the street and make right what I've done to you. I'm willing to listen to whatever you have to say, just not today. I'm here to make these things right. And my history with my father was I would argue with him, and I would always really try to go through and push his buttons, right? And essentially, I made that amends and was able to steer the conversation in a way, and it was really God directing everything. And then some of the other things that have happened that are crazy. It's funny you said you flew out to California. I've had on 2 occasions gone to another place for a conference, and somebody was there. First one was my ex-girlfriend that I had while I was drinking, and I tried to find this person for 2 years, probably trying to make amends for selfish reasons, and just wasn't in the cards. Couldn't find them. And then she was actually getting out of treatment, and she had went to Austin from Louisiana, and we were both in Austin at the same time. This is before I moved here, and I made that amends. And she tried to give back the money. It was financial, and obviously there was way more than financial stuff that I had done to her. And I just made it, and it worked out. Another one was a friend that I tried to find for years, and he had been working in the oil field, and it was in Arkansas, and then also was living in Louisiana. He was randomly in there, and he could drink normally, I guess you could say. And I made the amends, and like he showed up at the conference with like a beer in his hand, and it was really interesting, right? And so you never know whenever God's going to put you in a place to make that amends. And a lot of these, like, I chased people down, I tried to find them, was unsuccessful for whatever reason, and God sometimes puts us in a place where we make the amends at the right place at the right time.
I love
that's
that.
other stories.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because it puts an exclamation mark on the idea that God's in charge, right? When you were talking about the amends that you were making to your father, I was thinking to myself, how is it that a 19-year-old can summon up those kinds of words to say to someone that you have this massive history with, like a father, right? How does a 19-year-old do that? Well, it's the only answer is God.
Yeah. And I think I tried to be very strategic about the amends, and obviously I just had to go out there and do it. Whoever would answer the door, or whoever would take the call, I would do it. I think I had done a few amends to my family and a few amends to some friends around me. And I mean, me and my dad, but as a result of making an amends and being Alcoholics Anonymous, and one of the things that I had a realization about my dad was he was just a drunk, just like I was. And I had done a lot of the same harm that he had done. And before he had died in 2017, we had a really great relationship. I actually spoke at his home group, and he gave me his 11-year chip right before he was diagnosed with cancer and died. And so I got to spend 11 years with this man, and being just another fellow in Alcoholics Anonymous, and being his son. So it was a result of the work, and it was a result of doing these things. And I think at that point I had just enough to walk through where I was changed just enough. And that was one of the moments where I was like, something's changed. I'm not the same person. I'm reacting differently to life.
I love that. I absolutely love that. You and I have talked both tonight a little bit about the idea of sponsorship. When you are teaching a sponsee how to take this particular step, is there one specific thing that you always want them to know about the step, or is there a specific way that you go about it that can help them really understand the power behind this step?
Sure. Yeah. There's a few things. First things, I define what an amends is, and I explain what exactly we're going to be doing. And I say it's not an apology, right? And you have to make that clear, because it doesn't matter how much people hear that. They need to see it in action, what that actually looks like. The other thing, the few things that I've never really heard anybody say this, and this has just been as a result of my experience and seeing that this didn't work so well. And really, I need to make this very simple to the core of what I'm trying to do whenever I'm meeting with somebody making amends. I also tell them to remove the whole part that they're in AA and that they're working 12 steps, because what that comes off as is, I'm here just to check a box, right? You
Right.
don't want that to be a thing. So I just tell them to remove that altogether. If it comes up and they want to talk about it, kind of exactly what the big book says. If it makes sense to talk about spiritual things, right? Do it, but you don't lead with that, right? And so I that's two things, obviously that are important. I also, when working with people, like to write out exactly what they're going to say before they say it. And I have a very strict thing, because I've done things where they was kind of sideways or had ill intentions of going out and making amends, and I've seen it several times where amends can be used for very selfish reasons, right? And so I also want to make sure that they're being as simple as possible whenever they're saying these things. Often we think we need to say a bunch of words, when in actuality, a lot of these people just want to actually see that we cared enough to go there and actually try to make things right. And in some circumstances, they don't even care at all. And you're in the story that you had provided, right? They don't, they have no plans on forgiving us at all. And so being very simple and using less words and not going down these rabbit holes of drawing out what I have to say, it really could be very simple. And I think the less words, the better in amends. You need to outline exactly what you did. You may not need to go to every nook and cranny of what you did to stir up, maybe some ill feelings. So being very simple. So those are some guiding principles that I give. And usually we talk about exactly what they're going to say and write it out.
I think I'm really glad that you suggested that, because that is one thing my sponsor has actually given to me as a suggestion as well. Not just about the amends process, but I find great benefit. I mean, the whole idea of putting pen to paper, right? There's power behind that. And for me, it's about clarity. And for me, it's also about, if I don't put it down on paper in front of me and I can see it in black and white, left to my own devices in a heated emotional moment, I don't know about you, but I'm oftentimes that person who it just all comes out sideways, right? And I never say exactly what I want to say. And I certainly don't get conveyed, in this case, the amends like I need to make. So writing it down provides that clarity. And I'm really, really glad that you suggested that. I want to read, if you don't mind, I'm going to read just an excerpt from the step study on takethe12.org on step 9. And we've kind of talked about it a little bit, but I want to pull back the layers of the onion and kind of flesh it out a little bit more. Step 9 is about taking action and making amends through 1, identifying hurt or harm caused, and 2, finding out how we can make it right to those that we've harmed in our drinking, right? Remember, it's not about, and you said this, it's not about saying I'm sorry. This step will provide us with the peace of mind, relief, and liberation from the chains of regret. I had tons of regret coming into the rooms of Alcoholics Anonymous, and I didn't even know I had it, right? But I read that part because I want to highlight the idea that if you look up the definition, or at least one definition of an amends, or to amend something is to make right. That's one definition of an amend or an amends. And I just always thought it was about saying I'm sorry. And nowhere in our literature, at least in the big book, does it say that we get to say I'm sorry. Now, there are a couple of references in the 12 and 12 in the essays in 8 and 9 that Bill wrote that kind of refer to saying I'm sorry. But when I'm working with a sponsee and I'm helping them learn how to walk through step 9, I kind of lay down the law, if you will, that I don't want you saying I'm sorry. That's not what our literature suggests that we do. It suggests that we go to the person that we have caused hurt and harm to, identify that hurt and harm, and then find out what we can do to make it right. I remember I had a sponsee once who said, well, I don't know if I harmed them. I said, well, then let's default to yes, you did. Let's just default to yes, you did. Go to them and put it out there. I believe that I caused you hurt and harm by fill in the blank, then ask the question, did I? And then shut up and let them tell you, because if you did, they're going to let you know. If you didn't, they're also going to let you know that as well. And then you can immediately go right into the, and what can I do to make it right? But I just wanted to separate the difference between identifying hurt and harm caused, finding out what we can do to make it right, and saying I'm sorry. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, those are the two parts. And you know, the book gives you situations of people making amends. It doesn't tell you what to say.
Right.
I you sound a lot like me. I tell my sponsees what they're going to say because it's really it's simple. A lot of times we think that you know, we're selfish people in nature, so we tend to think that us saying things is going to fix it, when actuality that's not what this is about. Um, Typically, this is the way that I outline them to make an amends. Is, let's say they stole a microwave from somebody. You go, so and so, look, I, you know, basically stole this microwave from you and caused distrust, and I hurt you by stealing this physical item, you know, from you. How can I make it right? You then listen to what they have to say.
Right.
That is the amends. You saying it isn't necessarily amends. The
Right.
listening to what they have to say. It's more of a conversation coming from them. So you talking less and them talking more is of utter importance in this whole situation. The second part, and is there anything else that I did to harm you, which I did not lay out today, or in a general way, you know, let it roll off the tongue, however it's naturally, but finding out, because that's the other part of the amends is, I don't know necessarily. I may be going in with about the microwave, and then I may like completely ignore the fact that there was like sleepless nights after that because I had stolen from them, and there was all these other things that I did that I completely neatly ignored, or I was in a blackout. I was blackout. I don't remember large chunks of that time of me drinking. So
Yeah.
that's the second part, and that usually will uncover things that aren't. And a lot of times, my amends were leading with what little I knew and hoping to uncover, because I felt that there was something else there, and then they can tell me. And then it may have been like a lot of it because I was a kid, obviously getting sober, and a lot of my drinking, I caused a lot of harm very early on in my life. You know, a lot of it was like, I need to make this amends because I vaguely remember being in a blackout, breaking into somebody's house, and it was like
Right.
my friend's mom or something like that, right? So I would like have recollections, but I didn't know exactly what I did. So I went into this amends, making the amends, but also like, are you sure there's nothing else? You know, like, because I don't really fully remember, you know, and I think that's how a lot of our stories are. Even if you weren't a blackout drinker, you had a lot of them. And then kind of going back to like funny situations, I had some amends like with my brother where he just completely said, you didn't hurt me, but like, I know I hurt you, you know, like, and so I just had to be quiet and listen. And so making an amends to my brother looked a lot different than making amends to somebody who was very vocal, because it was very vocal about not trusting me for first couple of years of my sobriety, and it took years of trust to gain back that trust with him, because he stepped up in a lot of. My parents were separated from since age 4. My dad got sober shortly after that, but my brother was really around most of the time and was more of a parental figure in our household because of just the way that we grew up. And so whenever I started drinking, he was always there, kind of as a father figure in a way. But years down the line, I'm at this adolescent treatment center working with some kids out there, and I meet this kid and come to find out that my brother had been working with him, trying to help him. He's a lawyer, basically out of some legal trouble because I had gotten sober, and he told this to this kid's parents, right? And he's offering them some, I guess, pro bono work. I don't know the details because he couldn't really discuss it with me, but that's what happened through the amends process with my brother. Even though he was like, you didn't hurt me. Like, obviously, like, there was trust that was broken there, and I had to just do what I could in the moment and listen, right? And sometimes that's not vocally from them, you know. Sorry to go off on a sidetrack tangent, but
No,
you know,
no, I think, and I think you absolutely nailed it. And the end result of all of this is that I just need to do the footwork and leave the results up to God. I just need to trust that God, once again, has got this. In you know, I when I'm making the distinction with someone I'm working with between an amends and an apology, because there's a massive difference between an amends and an apology. Um, you know, I, I offer an apology. I say, I'm sorry. Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean to step on your toe. I really apologize for stepping on your toe. I need to make an amends if I sleep with your wife. I have caused hurt and harm, right? And it's, to me, those drastic differences are the way that I can understand the difference between an amends and an apology. And I just make sure that folks understand that step 9 is not about apologizing. It is about making right the hurt and harm that we caused, and trusting that through that footwork that God's gonna take it, and it's all gonna be just fine.
Yeah. And there's certain situations, especially with step 10, where an apology may be what you need to do. And if it's
Exactly.
like, you know, very quickly, if something's, I kind of look at it like this: very quickly, if something happened and you just know that you were wrong about something, saying, "Hey, I apologize, I was wrong." If that's as far as it needs to go, that's as far as it needs to go. If it's like something else and you've been sober, and you've gone through this amends process and you really know that you've lied or you've stolen or you've done other things to cause harm to somebody, then yeah, it's more of a proper an amends, right? But in some situations, saying I'm sorry is all that's needed. Just acknowledging that I was wrong, and that's it, very intensely. And it even says that,
Right.
and later in steps 10 and 11. So
Absolutely. As we begin to wind this down, I want to ask one last question. I really am a big believer that inventory on a regular basis is vital to the maintenance of my spiritual condition. What around step 9, around going back to the beginning of the conversation where I shared that I believe the spiritual principle underneath step 9 is discipline, where what does inventory look like in your life today around the spiritual principle or around this step?
sure. So I typically, aside from the amends where people, it was like either I couldn't find these people or whatever around year 8, they had like a small list of those people, and then there was institutions that I didn't do it. I've been of the school of thought, I I don't want to walk around with this. And I treat all of my inventory like that, because the beauty of step 10 is that no matter where I'm at in the day or what's going on, I could always pause, take a second, and say, why am I resentful? What am I resentful at? What part of self is at stake? What instinct is being hurt right now? And basically not you know not looking at it from their with them or whatever situation is involved at all, just looking exactly at what I've done wrong,
Right.
and not separating the two, just saying, where am I wrong in this situation, and acknowledging in that, and then going out and making an amends. And that's why I love, after I've gone through the process of inventory and also gone through and made amends, steps 1 through 9 enable me to do 10, 11, and 12. And that's what I feel like is what it's not necessarily their purpose, but that's what it does. It enables me to go through and do that. And those principles in daily living, are what make me useful and whole, in my opinion, of course, in
Yeah.
my experience.
No,
And
I totally
so
agree.
it always starts with inventory. So it always starts with, what is it? What's bothering me? Because sometimes it's so subtle and so beneath the skin that I don't even want to admit it, because of ego, that something's even wrong, right?
Right.
I'm too sober to be mad at this, but coming back to it, and then also I make amends very quickly if I've caused harm. There's been few and far between where amends have gone on a few weeks, if not a month, where I had owed amends to somebody. I'm usually pretty quick, within the same day or a couple of days. And in certain situations, obviously, there is some spiritual guidance there where maybe I don't need, maybe the best thing is not to go make the amends immediately, because they're very burnt up about it, right? And so,
Right.
uh, in situations like that, I kind of have to step back. But most of them aren't like that. Most of them are very quick. And if I can inventory it very, very quickly and thoroughly, I can get to that part where I make amends and then go about being productive and not having this weigh me down. Because that's what it does. Not making the amends weighs me down, you know?
Mm, I love that. What a perfect way to end this. We're out of time, Matt. Is there anything that you would like to offer as a closing comment on step 9? Anything that you want our listeners to remember as they begin to put the spiritual principle into practical application in their lives?
Yeah, I mean, if you're listening and you're on this step, essentially, uh, it could be very daunting to look at that list, especially coming out of an inventory where you've really looked at all these things and come to the realization that you probably are the reason why a lot of those things happened the way that they did. That's what happened to me, at least. Um, it could be very daunting to go back and to kind of what you were saying about regret. I spent probably the first month or few months of my sobriety not being able to go to sleep at night because I had like a broken record going on where I relived all of these things coming out of blackouts, harming people and doing these things. And like, it was a real. So if you're on this step or you're approaching this step, the question that was always asked to me, if there's some reluctance there, is how free do you want to be?
That's right.
Because that's what's on the other end of it. This program promises freedom from alcohol, but it's a little bit more than just that. The freedom that I get from working the steps is huge, and it's what I needed all along that I didn't know. And so thank you for
Right.
asking me for coming.
I love it. And I'm glad you mentioned the promises, because certainly in the 9th step promises and all of the promises that are in our book, every single one of them are conditional. It's an if then, right? If you do this, you're going to get this, or if you want this, you need to do this. And so I love that you kind of just made it so simple that I just don't want it to weigh me down. I don't want to carry this around anymore. So, Matt, thank you so much for your time and for your service. I'm confident that our listeners are going to take away a lot from your sharing. So thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you, Rick, and you have a wonderful night.
You too. Just a reminder to everyone that you can go to takethe12.org to learn more about all 3 of our legacies in AA through STEP, Tradition, and Concept Studies, blog posts, videos, books, and so much more. Until next time, let us not forget Bill W.'s words when he said this: "We clearly see AA in 3 dimensions: the dimension of recovery, the dimension of unity, and the dimension of service. Without any one of these, AA couldn't function." God bless.